My name is Elias Vance. Until 3 months ago, I was an archivist for the city of Charlotte, a job that suited my temperament perfectly. I am, by nature, a man who appreciates order, verifiable facts, and the quiet, logical narrative that primary sources can provide. History, to me, is not a collection of stories, but a series of documented events, each with a cause and an effect. I find comfort in the tangible, in the crisp texture of acid, free paper, the scent of aging ink, and the weight of a bound ledger in my hands. I am 32 years old, and I have always believed that for every mystery is an explanation waiting to be uncovered through diligent research and rational inquiry. This belief system was, perhaps, the first casualty of my inheritance. The letter from the solicitor's office arrived on a Tuesday, a particularly bleak day following my department's downsizing. My position, deemed a non-essential luxury in a time of budget cuts, had been eliminated. I was adrift, facing a mountain of bills with a severance package that was evaporating far faster than I'd anticipated. The letter informed me that my great-uncle, Arthur Vance, a man I knew only as a whispered name, a familial ghost story my grandmother refused to elaborate on, had passed away. More astonishingly, he had named me as the sole heir to his estate. The estate, as it turned out, consisted of a single asset, a cabin and several dozen acres of land, deep in the Appalachian mountains of western North Carolina. My family's reaction was strange. There was no sadness for Arthur's passing, only a palpable discomfort. He was reclusive. My father had said, his eyes refusing to meet mine. He went up into those hills and never came back. It's better not to ask questions, son, but asking questions is what I do. My curiosity, coupled with my dire financial situation, made the decision for me. I had no other assets, no promising job prospects. This remote piece of land was my only lifeline. I packed my life, mostly books, research materials, and clothes, into my aging sedan and drove west, away from the city, and towards a life I couldn't begin to imagine. My plan was simple: assess the property, make it livable, and use the solitude to figure out my next move. I saw it as a practical solution, a temporary retreat born of necessity. I harbored a professional curiosity about the family's black sheep, but I certainly wasn't expecting to find anything more than an old man's eccentricities. The drive itself was a process of disconnection. The 4-lane highways gave way to 2-lane country roads, which in turn narrowed into winding asphalt paths that clung precariously to the sides of mountains. My phone's signal bars dwindled, one by one, until the screen displayed a final, definitive, no service. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of damp earth, pine, and something else, something ancient and wild. The mountains rose around me, not as picturesque postcards, but as immense, silent titans of stone and forest. They seemed to absorb the sound of my engine. The silence they returned was so profound it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. After a final, jarring stretch on a gravel road that was little more than 2 ruts in the dirt, I found it. The cabin was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by a dense wall of hemlock and oak trees that loomed like silent sentinels. It was old, built from dark, hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a deep, set porch. It looked less like a house and more like a natural outgrowth of the forest itself, weathered and sturdy. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. It was a roof over my head. It was real. The isolation, however, was absolute. There were no other houses in sight. No distant sounds of traffic or civilization. The only sound was the sighing of the wind through the canopy high above. The forest pressed in on all sides, so dense that the shadows it cast seemed to have a weight and texture of their own. It was beautiful in a severe and intimidating way, but it was a beauty that felt latently menacing, as if I were an intruder in a place that had long forgotten the presence of men. Inside, the cabin was a time capsule. Dust motes dance in the shafts of light slanting through the grimy windows. It was filled with the simple, rustic furniture of a life lived in solitude: a heavy wooden table, a stone fireplace dominating one wall, shelves crammed with yellowed paperbacks, and jars of unidentifiable preserves. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, dust, and old paper. As I began the methodical task of cleaning, of imposing my own order on my great uncle's dusty legacy, I felt a sense of purpose return. This was manageable. This was a problem I could solve. It was while wiping down the thick layer of dust from the stone mantelpiece that I found it. A heavy, foolscap envelope, yellowed with age, was propped against a stack of old almanacs. My name, Elias Vance, was written across the front in a spidery, slightly trembling script. It was sealed with a blob of dark red wax. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside, there were 2 items: a single, folded sheet of paper and a thicker, multi-page document stapled at the corner. The first was a letter. Elias, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the property is now yours. I am sorry for this. I hope you will one day forgive me. I had no one else to leave it to, and it cannot be left empty. Know this. This land is both a gift and a curse. It will provide for you, shelter you, but it will also test you. Your survival here, your very sanity, depends on one thing and one thing only. You must follow the rules. All of them, without question and without fail. Do not dismiss this as the ramblings of a lonely old man. Your modern, rational world has no place here. The old ways, the old things, still hold sway in these mountains. The list enclosed is not a set of suggestions. It is your only defense. Read it. Memorize it. Live by it. I hope you are stronger than I was. Arthur Vance. I read the letter twice, a cold knot forming in my stomach. It was absurd. The tone was so grim, so utterly serious. My first thought was that my great uncle had succumbed to dementia or a profound paranoia brought on by decades of isolation. It was tragic but not supernatural. I was an archivist. I dealt in facts, not folklore. With a sigh that was part pity, part condescension, I picked up the second document, the rules of the property. Go, 1. Do not leave any doors or windows open after sundown. Not even a crack. The night air carries whispers, and you do not want to hear them. 2. If the creek behind the house runs milky white, do not drink the tap water for 24 hours. Boil snow if you must. It is thirsty. 3. You will sometimes see lights in the woods at night. They are not hikers. Do not approach them. Do not acknowledge them. Draw the curtains and do not look again until morning. 4. Never answer a knock at the door after midnight. No one good is walking this path at that hour. If the knocking comes in a distinct pattern of 3, knock, 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 go to the cellar immediately. Do not come out until you hear the rooster crow at dawn. 5. Keep the small ceramic basins on the windowsills filled with salt. If you find one empty in the morning, replace the salt immediately, and do not sleep in that room for one night. 6. Do not bring any part of the forest's flora into the cabin, save for firewood that is dead and dry. No flowers, no moss, no interesting leaves. They carry spores of memory, and you do not want them to take root in your house. 7. If you hear a woman humming an old lullaby outside, lock the bedroom door and put a pillow over your head. It is a lure. She is not who she seems, and what she wants is the warmth in your bones. 8. The old stone well in the yard is not for water. Do not look down into it for more than a moment. If you drop something in, it is lost forever. Consider it a toll paid. No, Agata, I set the list down on the dusty table, a short, sharp laugh escaping my lips. It was even more ridiculous than I'd imagined. It is thirsty. Spores of memory. It was the stuff of cheap horror novels, not reality. My great-uncle had clearly lost his mind. Still, a part of me, the archivist part, felt a strange compulsion. I folded the list and the letter carefully and placed them back in the envelope, tucking it into my jacket pocket. A primary source. I thought grimly, on one man's descent into madness. The rest of the day was spent in a flurry of physical activity. I swept floors, scrubbed surfaces, and aired out the musty rooms. As evening approached, the sky turned a brilliant, bruised purple and orange. The air grew cool and crisp. It was a beautiful, peaceful evening, the kind of quiet I had once craved in the city. The first rule came to mind. Do not leave any doors or windows open after sundown. I glanced at the window above the small desk, where I'd decided to set up my workspace. It was a small, sliding window, and I'd left it open just a few inches to let the fresh mountain air circulate. To close it felt like giving in to the paranoid fantasy of a dead man. It felt like a betrayal of my own rational mind. I was a man of logic. The air was cool and refreshing. I would not be ruled by superstition. I left it open. Night fell quickly in the mountains, a sudden, heavy blanket of darkness that seemed to swallow the light whole. I made a simple dinner and sat at the desk, trying to formulate a plan on a yellow legal pad. I was surrounded by the comforting quiet of the wilderness. The only sounds were the gentle chirping of crickets and the scratching of my own pen on the paper. I must have been working for an hour or two when I first heard it. It was faint, at the very edge of my hearing, a sound from the direction of the open window. I paused, pen hovering over the paper. It wasn't the wind, which had died down completely. It wasn't an animal. It was a sibilant, whispering sound. Sis, shiss. I strained to listen, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. The sound grew slightly, resolving not into a single voice, but into many. It sounded like dozens of people whispering at once, their voices overlapping in a dry, rustling chorus. The language was utterly alien, full of soft consonants and long, drawn-out hisses. It was not human. The sound seemed to slither through the small gap in the window and pool in the corner of the room, a pocket of cold, malevolent sound. A wave of pure, primal dread washed over me. It was a feeling that bypassed my intellect entirely, a cold spike of fear that shot up my spine and exploded in my chest. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't my imagination. It was real. My body moved before my mind could process it. I lunged from the chair, my hands fumbling with the window lock. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if it knew it was being discovered. It felt like it was trying to tell me something, a secret so terrible that hearing it would shatter my mind. With a final, desperate shove, I slammed the window shut and twisted the lock into place. The sound stopped. Not faded, not tapered off. It was cut off instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. The silence that rushed back in was 1,000 times more terrifying than the noise it replaced. It was a heavy, listening silence, an expectant silence. I stood there, panting, my back pressed against the wall, staring at the black pane of glass. My entire body was trembling. Slowly, shakily, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope. My fingers, slick with a cold sweat, unfolded the list of rules. I read the first one again, the words seeming to glow on the page in the dim lamplight. Do not leave any doors or windows open after sundown, not even a crack. The night air carries whispers, and you do not want to hear them. My skepticism had not just been challenged, it had been executed. I spent the rest of that first night in a chair pushed against the main door, wide awake, clutching the list of my dead uncle's rules as if it were the only prayer I knew. The sun rose, but it brought no comfort. Dawn in the city had always been a promise of continuity. The familiar rumble of traffic a reassurance that the world was still turning as it should. Here, the sunrise was a silent, almost accusatory event. The light crept over the jagged peaks and filtered through the dense canopy, illuminating a world that felt just as alien and menacing as it had in the dark. I had not slept. I'd spent the night in a hard-backed chair. The list of rules clutched in my hand, my ears straining against the profound silence, half expecting the whispers to return. They did not. My first conscious act of the day was to conduct a full security sweep of the cabin, a methodical patrol born of newfound terror. Every window latch was checked, every door bolt secured. The small gap in the window I had so arrogantly left open was now my enemy, a symbol of my near-fatal ignorance. The rational archivist in me was not dead, but he had been demoted. He was no longer in charge. He was now a consultant to a far more primal entity whose only concern was survival. My eyes fell upon the list again. I smoothed the creased paper on the table, my gaze drawn to Rule 25E. Keep the small ceramic basins on the windowsills filled with salt. If you find one empty in the morning, replace the salt immediately and do not sleep in that room for one night. With a sense of grim duty, I began my inspection. There were 4 windows in the main room, each with a small, shallow ceramic bowl on the sill, exactly as the rule described. They were filled with coarse rock salt, which had yellowed slightly with age. 3 were undisturbed, but the basin on the sill of the window I had left open was empty. Not just empty, but clean. There wasn't a single grain of salt remaining, nor any residue. It was as if it had been licked clean by a dry, invisible tongue. A cold dread, now becoming a familiar companion, trickled down my spine. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty bowl. The whispers had been outside, but something had been inside, silently consuming the salt meant to deter. What? I didn't know, and I found I didn't want to know. I located a large sack of rock salt in the pantry, another of Arthur's strange provisions, and refilled the basin, my hand shaking slightly. I made a mental note. I would sleep in the chair again tonight. The bedroom, with its own windows and its own salt basins, suddenly felt miles away, an unsecurable frontier. The day stretched before me, a vast expanse of time to be filled. I couldn't stay huddled in the cabin, a prisoner to my fear. I needed to understand the geography of my prison. The list was my constitution, the land its jurisdiction. I needed to see the landmarks it mentioned. Rule Fate 2 spoke of a creek. Rule Fate 8 a well. I had to know where they were. Stepping outside felt like a transgression. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of decaying leaves and rich soil. The forest was alive with the chittering of squirrels and the calls of birds, sounds that should have been comforting, but instead felt like a language I couldn't understand, a conversation I was not welcome in. I kept the cabin in sight as I began a slow, deliberate circuit of the clearing. I found the well first. It was about 50 yards from the cabin, a circular structure of moss, covered stones that rose about 3 feet from the ground. It was old, the stones weathered and dark, and it was covered by a heavy, rotting wooden lid. A thick, rusted chain was wrapped around it, held fast by a padlock that looked as ancient as the well itself. My archivist's mind noted the craftsmanship, the sheer age of it. My survivor's mind felt a palpable aura of rumness emanating from it. I remembered the rule. The old stone well in the yard is not for water. Do not look down into it for more than a moment. The padlock, I realized, was not to keep people out. It was to keep something in. I felt no temptation to open it. I gave the well a wide berth and continued my patrol. The creek was behind the house, just as the rule stated. It was a shallow, fast, moving stream, cutting a path through the forest over a bed of smooth, gray stones. The water was so clear it was practically invisible, the sound of its passage a pleasant, gurgling music. I knelt by its bank, cupping my hands and drinking deeply. The water was icy cold and tasted of stone and earth. It was the purest water I'd ever had. I looked upstream and downstream. It was just a creek, a perfectly normal, beautiful mountain stream. For a moment, my rational mind reasserted itself. Perhaps the whispers had been a trick of the wind. Perhaps the salt had been eaten by a mouse. Perhaps my great-uncle had simply been a lonely, mad old man. I spent the rest of the day forcing a sense of normalcy. I organized Arthur's books, swept the floors again, and took inventory of the canned goods in the pantry. There was enough to last for months. Arthur had been a prepper, but not for a nuclear winter or a societal collapse. He had been preparing for a siege of a different kind. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself needing to refill my water bottle. I walked back to the creek, the pleasant gurgling a welcome sound in the oppressive silence. I stopped dead at the edge of the trees. It was the same creek, in the same location, but it was utterly transformed. The water was no longer clear. It was a thick, opaque, sickly white. It flowed with the same speed, but its color was the color of cataracts, of spoiled milk, of bone. It wasn't just cloudy with sediment. It was a uniform, unnatural, viscous-looking white. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through me. I took a step back, my throat suddenly dry. Rule Fight 2 screamed in my mind. If the creek behind the house runs milky white, do not drink the tap water for 24 hours. Boil snow if you must. It is thirsty. It was late autumn. There was no snow. The cabin's plumbing, I now realized with a jolt of horror, must draw directly from this creek. The tap water was poison. I looked at the milky water flowing over the stones, and the final sentence of the rule echoed in the silence. It is thirsty. Thirsty for what? The question was too monstrous to contemplate. I turned and fled back to the relative safety of the cabin, my mind racing. I had a few bottles of water I'd brought from the city, maybe a gallon in total. After that, I had nothing. My lifeline, the clear, cold water, had been severed. Night fell again, and this time the darkness felt predatory. I sat at the table, the cabin sealed tight, the salt basins full. My meager supply of bottled water sat before me, a testament to my vulnerability. The silence was absolute. There were no crickets tonight. No wind. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath. And then I saw them. Through a small gap in the curtains I had failed to fully close, I saw a light. It was in the woods, maybe 100 yards away. It was a pale, phosphorescent green, bobbing gently in the darkness. My first foolish thought was a person. A hiker with a flashlight, perhaps the local sheriff checking on the property. Hope, desperate and stupid, flared in my chest. I almost stood up, almost went to the door to call out. But the light moved in a way that was deeply wrong. It didn't bob and weave with the gait of a person walking on uneven ground. It floated, smooth and silent, gliding between the trees with an unnatural grace. Then another light appeared, this one a soft blue, and another a pale yellow. Soon there were a dozen of them, a silent constellation of ghostly lights, drifting through the black woods. They moved without a sound, weaving intricate, hypnotic patterns in the darkness. Rule Feint 3. You will sometimes see lights in the woods at night. They are not hikers. Do not approach them. Do not acknowledge them. Draw the curtains and do not look again until morning. My hand trembled as I reached for the curtain. A part of me, the part that craved knowledge and explanation, screamed to keep watching. To document their movements, their colors, their behavior. It was a phenomenon. It needed to be studied. But the fear was colder, wiser. It knew that some things were not meant to be understood, only survived. I pulled the curtain shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. I sat in the darkness, the image of the silent. Dancing lights burned into my retinas. They were out there. The whispers were in the air. The creek was thirsty. The salt was being eaten. This was not a series of isolated incidents. It was a coordinated assault. The rules were not a list of my great uncle's delusions. They were articles of surrender. They were the terms of a treaty I had unknowingly signed the moment I inherited this land. And I was beginning to understand, with a clarity that was more terrifying than any madness, that I was not the owner of this property. I was its prisoner. The third day began not with a sunrise, but with a headache, a dull, throbbing pressure behind my eyes that was born from a night of absolute vigilance and a profound lack of sleep. The ghostly lights in the woods had eventually faded, but their memory had not. I had spent the remaining hours of darkness, sitting in the chair, my back to the windows, flinching at every natural creak and groan of the old cabin. My world had shrunk to the four walls of this room, and the terrifying authority of the list in my pocket. My most immediate and pressing problem was water. The single gallon of bottled water I'd brought was now less than half full. My throat was perpetually dry, a constant, nagging reminder of my vulnerability. The milky white creek flowed mockingly, just beyond the tree line, a river of poison. The rule had been, not drink the tap water for 24 hours. But it had been nearly a full day since the water had turned. What would happen after the 24-hour mark? Would it simply turn clear again, the threat receding as mysteriously as it had arrived? Or was that just the window of its most acute danger? The rules were a guide, but they were full of terrifying ambiguities. I couldn't afford to wait and see. My logical mind, though battered and bruised, insisted on action. There had to be another water source. A spring, another stream, anything. Staying inside was a slow death by dehydration. Going outside was something else. But I had no choice. Before I left, I performed my morning ritual. I checked the salt basins. This time, all were full. A small, pathetic flicker of relief went through me. Whatever had consumed the salt the first night had been satisfied or deterred. I secured the cabin as if I were leaving for a month, checking every lock twice. I took a small backpack, a compass, and my dwindling water bottle. I left the list on the table. I already had it memorized. The forest felt different in the daylight. The raw menace of the night was replaced by a more subtle, watchful hostility. The silence was unnerving. There were no birds singing, no squirrels chattering in the branches. The entire wood seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. I decided to walk parallel to the tainted creek, heading upstream. My reasoning was simple. Whatever was contaminating the water had to have a source. If I could find it, perhaps I could bypass it. The hike was arduous. The undergrowth was thick, clawing at my clothes. The ground was a treacherous carpet of slick roots and moss-covered rocks. After an hour of slow, careful progress, I noticed a change in the flora. The familiar oaks and hemlocks began to thin, replaced by gnarled, twisted trees I didn't recognize. Their bark was a pale, sickly gray, and their branches grew in tight, unnatural spirals. The air grew colder here, and there was a faint, sweet smell, like flowers left to rot in a vase. It was here that I found it. A small tributary, no wider than my arm, was feeding into the main creek. Its water was the source of the contamination. It was a thick, viscous, milky, white liquid, oozing from a fissure in the rock face, about 20 feet above the creek bed. It wasn't water at all. It was some kind of mineral seepage, a pale, liquid wound in the earth. The sight of it was profoundly unnatural, and I felt a primal urge to get away from it. As I turned to leave, my foot slipped on a wet stone. I flailed, my arm shooting out to break my fall. My hand brushed against a low-hanging branch, and I felt a sharp, stinging sensation on my wrist. I scrambled back to my feet, my heart pounding from the near fall. I glanced at my wrist. There were 3 small, red puncture marks, already beading with blood, as if I'd been bitten. I looked at the branch I had hit. Growing from the pale, twisted wood was a single, impossible flower. It was a deep, velvety black, its petals shaped like a star. It was the most beautiful and most repulsive thing I had ever seen. It seemed to drink the light, a perfect void in the shape of a blossom. I hadn't just touched it. A thorn needle, sharp and dark, had broken off in my skin. Rule Phase 6 flooded my mind, cold and absolute. Do not bring any part of the forest's flora into the cabin, save for firewood that is dead and dry. No flowers, no moss, no interesting leaves. They carry spores of memory, and you do not want them to take root in your house. I had not brought it into the cabin. It had brought itself into me. Panic, stark and blinding, seized me. I used my pocket knife to dig frantically at my wrist. My surgical precision gone, replaced by a desperate, animalistic need to get the thorn out. I managed to gouge the black splinter from my flesh and fling it away, leaving a ragged, bleeding wound. I stumbled back the way I came, crashing through the undergrowth, not caring about the noise, my only thought to get back to the cabin, to the salt, to the rules. Back inside, with the door bolted, I cleaned the wound with the last of my precious bottled water. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the cloth. The physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological terror. Spores of memory. What did it mean? I sat at the table, staring at my bandaged wrist, my mind a whirlwind of fear. As the afternoon bled into evening, I began to understand. It started subtly. I would look at the stone fireplace, and for a fleeting second, I would see a fire roaring in it and feel a phantom warmth on my face. But it wasn't my memory. In the vision, my hands were different, older, gnarled with arthritis. I glanced at the bookshelf, and for a moment, I didn't see my own collection of historical texts, but rows and rows of jars filled with herbs and tinctures. I could almost smell them. They were flashes, fragments of someone else's life. Arthur's life. The spore was growing. It was planting his memories, his experiences, his fears directly into my mind. I was becoming a living archive of my great-uncle's madness, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that his madness hadn't been madness at all. It had been knowledge. Night fell. I didn't light the lamp. I sat in the dark, feeling the foreign memories bloom and wither behind my own. I remembered the fear of a knocking at the door, the specific chill of hearing a woman's voice on the wind. These were not my fears, but I was feeling them as if they were. And then I heard it. It was faint at first, carried on a breeze that seemed to slip through the sealed cracks of the cabin walls. A woman's voice humming. It was a simple, beautiful melody, an old lullaby that was both soothing and deeply melancholic. It seemed to promise peace, comfort, an end to the terror. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, and it was a lie. Rule Phase 7. If you hear a woman humming an old lullaby outside, lock the bedroom door and put a pillow over your head. It is a lure. She is not who she seems, and what she wants is the warmth in your bones. The humming grew louder, closer. It was right outside the main window now. I could feel the allure of it, a siren song for the soul, shipwrecked. It promised everything I craved: safety, an end to fear, human contact. A part of me, a deep, lonely part, wanted to go to the window, to see the face of the singer. Arthur's memory screamed a warning in my head. I saw through his eyes a glimpse of a pale face, of eyes that were not eyes, of a smile that was not a smile. I scrambled away from the window, my breath catching in my throat. I fled into the small, dark bedroom, slamming the door shut and fumbling to turn the old skeleton key in the lock. I dove onto the bed, grabbing the pillow and pressing it over my head, trying to block out the sound. But I could still hear it, muffled but clear, a melody of pure, predatory grace. I could feel it trying to seep into my mind, to find the cracks, to soothe me into submission. I lay there, trembling, for what felt like an eternity, until, finally, the humming faded into silence. The silence that followed was worse. I lay in the darkness, my ears ringing. I was just beginning to think it was over when the new sound started. Knock. It was at the main cabin door. A single, solid, deliberate rap of a knuckle on wood. My blood ran cold. Knock. It came again. Solid. Patient. I held my breath, praying it was a branch, an animal, anything. Knock. The third one. A pattern. A summons. Rule 84. Never answer a knock at the door after midnight. No one good is walking this path at that hour, if the knocking comes in a distinct pattern of 3. Knock, knock, knock. Go to the cellar immediately. Do not come out until you hear the rooster crow at dawn. The pattern repeated. Knock, knock. Louder this time. More insistent. It wasn't asking for entry. It was announcing its presence. It knew I was here. I slid off the bed, my legs unsteady. The bedroom door, my only barrier, felt flimsy and useless. I had to get to the cellar. The cellar door was in the floor of the main room, a heavy trapdoor with an iron ring set into it. I had to unlock the bedroom door, cross the main room while that thing was knocking, and get into the cellar. No see. No see. The force of it shook the entire cabin this time. A jar rattled on a shelf. I unlocked the bedroom door, my hands slick with sweat. The main room was pitch black, but the knocking filled the space, a physical presence in the darkness. I stumbled across the room, my hands outstretched, my feet finding the rough, hewn trapdoor. I pulled on the iron ring. The door was heavy, swollen with damp. It lifted with a groan of protesting wood, revealing a square of absolute blackness and the smell of cold earth and stone. Kenosuke. Kenosuke. It was right behind me now. I didn't look back. I swung my legs over the edge and found the first rung of the wooden ladder. I scrambled down into the darkness, my feet hitting the damp dirt floor. Above me, the knocking stopped. A new sound began. A slow, deliberate scratching at the door. I reached up, grabbed the iron ring, and pulled the heavy trapdoor shut, plunging myself into total, suffocating darkness. The darkness in the cellar was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical substance. It was cold, heavy, and smelled of damp earth, rotting potatoes, and something else, something metallic and ancient like long, dried blood. I stood on the dirt floor, my body rigid, every muscle coiled in terror. Above me, the scratching continued. It was a slow, methodical sound, the noise of immense, patient claws dragging across the thick wood of the trapdoor. My rational mind, what was left of it, tried to conjure explanations: a bear, a mountain lion. But my heart knew better. Arthur's memories, now a constant, low hum in the back of my skull, supplied the truth in flashes of cold, secondhand terror. I saw through his eyes the splintered remains of a door, the inside of the cabin impossibly cold, and a shape, a shadow that was not a shadow, unfolding itself in the doorway. The cellar was not a hiding place. It was a quarantine. The scratching stopped. For a long, terrible moment, there was only silence. I held my breath, my ears straining, trying to hear past the frantic drumming of my own heart. Then came a new sound, a deep, resonant groan from the wood of the trapdoor, directly above my head. It was not the sound of something scratching it, but of something pressing down on it, an immense, impossible weight. The thick timbers creaked and moaned, the sound of a ship's hull breaking apart. Dust and bits of dirt rained down on my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, convinced the door would splinter, and that I would finally see the thing that had knocked. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for the end. Time ceased to have meaning in that suffocating blackness. The pressure on the door above was relentless, a constant, silent siege. My mind, stripped of all external stimuli, turned inward, and the spores of memory bloomed. I didn't just see Arthur's life. I felt it. I felt his loneliness, a vast, aching chasm carved out by decades of this vigilance. I felt his terror, a constant companion that had weathered him like the stones of the well. But underneath it all, I felt something else, a grim, unyielding sense of duty. He hadn't been a prisoner here. He had been a warden. The rules were not for his protection. They were for ours. The salt in the basins, the sealed windows, the avoidance of the lights. They were not just defenses. They were rituals of containment. They were the bars of a cage that was not built of iron, but of belief and adherence. This land, this small pocket of the world, was a wound, and Arthur had been its bandage. He hadn't been trying to keep things out. He had been trying to keep them in. And now the duty was mine. The letter had said, "It cannot be left empty." It wasn't about property law. It was a law of nature, or something that predated it. The position of warden had to be filled. The weight on the door remained, a silent, crushing testament to the power waiting, just feet above my head. I lost track of hours. My body ached, my throat was a desert, but the fear kept me standing. I was adrift in the dark, clinging to the hope of a single sound. And then it came. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Cock-a-doodle-doo, a rooster. Somewhere, in the nascent light of the false dawn, a rooster was crowing. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Instantly, the pressure above me vanished. Not eased, not lifted, but gone. One moment the timbers were groaning under an impossible load. The next, there was nothing. The silence that followed was different. It was not the expectant, predatory silence of the night, but a hollow, empty silence. The presence was gone. I waited, listening, until I heard the familiar sounds of the morning. A bird chirping, the wind rustling the leaves. Only then did I dare to move. My legs were stiff, my body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. I found the ladder and climbed, pushing against the trapdoor. It swung open easily, revealing the main room of the cabin, bathed in the soft, gray light of dawn. The room was cold, a deep, unnatural chill that clung to the air. But it was empty. I crept to the main door, my eyes scanning for any sign of the visitor. The door was intact, the bolts still thrown. But it was covered in long, deep scratches. 4 of them, running parallel from top to bottom. Gouged deep into the wood, splintering it in places. They were not the marks of any animal I could name. The claws that made them had been as wide as my hand. My first thought was water. I stumbled to the back of the cabin and looked out the window towards the creek. The 24 hours had passed. With a sense of profound dread, I looked towards the stream. It was clear. The milky whiteness was gone, replaced by the sparkling, transparent water I had seen on my first day. It flowed over the stones as if nothing had happened. I wept with relief, the tears hot on my cold face. I spent the day in a haze of exhaustion. I drank deeply from the creek, the cold water a balm to my parched throat. I forced myself to eat, and I thought. Arthur's memories were clearer now, less fragmented. They were integrating with my own, creating a terrible, shared consciousness. I understood the humming woman, the lights, the thirsty creek. They were all aspects of this place, the land itself testing its boundaries, probing for weakness in its containment. My role was not to defeat them. It was to appease them, to manage them, to perform the small rituals that kept the ancient treaty intact. As dusk began to settle, casting long, dark shadows across the clearing, I knew what I had to do. There was one rule I had not yet fully confronted, the final one on the list. Rule Fate 8. The old stone well in the yard is not for water. Do not look down into it for more than a moment. If you drop something in, it is lost forever. Consider it a toll paid. I walked out to the well, the rusted padlock on its chain looking like a final seal on a tomb. From my pocket, I took the key Arthur had left, the one that opened the cabin's front door. It fit the ancient padlock. With a grating shriek of metal, the lock sprang open. I unwound the heavy chain and, with a deep breath, lifted the rotting wooden lid. A wave of cold, stagnant air washed over me. A smell of deep earth and decay and something else. A smell of utter emptiness, of a void that had a scent. I obeyed the rule and did not look down for more than a second. It was long enough. I saw not the bottom of a well, but a perfect, unreflective blackness, a darkness that did not seem to be the absence of light, but a thing unto itself. Consider it a toll paid. A toll for what? For living here, for peace. Arthur's memory supplied the answer. It was not a toll. It was a contract. It was an offering of acceptance. A formal declaration of the passing of the torch. I reached into my wallet, my hand closing around the laminated card that had once defined me. Elias Vance, City Archivist. It represented my old life, my belief in logic, in verifiable facts. In a world where everything had a rational explanation. It was a relic from a world that no longer existed for me. It was the part of me that had to be sacrificed. I held the card over the black opening. For a moment, I hesitated. I could still run. I could get in my car and drive until the gas ran out, and never look back. But Arthur's memories showed me the consequences. The scratches on the door becoming a shattered frame. The whispers becoming screams that crossed miles. The milky water flowing down the mountain and into the towns below. The cage would break. The warden would be gone. My choice was no choice at all. I let the card drop. It made no sound. It did not splash, it did not clatter against stone. It simply vanished into the silent, waiting blackness. It was lost forever. A toll paid. As I stood there, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut. But it was no longer overwhelming. It was now a part of the landscape of my mind. The headache from the spore was gone. The foreign memories were no longer foreign. They were mine now. I replaced the heavy wooden lid, wound the chain, and clicked the padlock shut. I walked back to the cabin not as a visitor, not as a victim, but as its caretaker. The sun had set, and the night air was beginning to carry its whispers. I went inside and, with a steady hand, I began my nightly ritual. I checked the latch on every window. I went to the pantry for the large sack of rock salt. I began to fill the small ceramic basins, one by one, preparing for the night. My name is Elias Vance, and this is my house. I must follow the rules.